Have you ever noticed how silence doesn't just surround you when you're alone, it starts to speak? At first, it's subtle, a quiet hum under your thoughts, but if you listen long enough, the silence grows teeth. It starts to echo your truths back to you, the ones you've spent your life avoiding, because when there's no one left to impress, no distractions left to numb you, and nothing left to prove, only one thing remains: yourself. And if that truth scares you, it means you've built a life around avoiding it. This is what most people call loneliness, but it's not. Loneliness is what you feel when the noise dies and your inner world suddenly becomes visible. And what you find there is not a lack of company. It's the absence of connection to your own soul. The real crisis isn't that you're alone. The crisis is that you don't know who you are when you're not performing. You'd been taught to see being alone as a red flag, a failure, a void to be filled. From childhood, every silence was quickly patched over. TV, toys, school, socializing, goals. Then came adulthood, and with it the more seductive distractions, achievements, relationships, scrolling, and a never-ending flood of validation opportunities. But behind all of it, the truth was always waiting. You were disconnected, not from the world, from yourself. You see, what you feel in moments of solitude is not punishment. It's a psychological unveiling. You're finally meeting the self that's been pushed into the background for years. But let's be honest, most people never let it get that far. The discomfort of being alone sends them racing for the nearest distraction, and so the pattern repeats. We say we're just bored, we say we're lonely, but in reality, we're terrified. Terrified of what might come to the surface if we sat still long enough to actually feel it. And yet, this is where the real work begins. The emptiness you feel, it's not emptiness, it's your shadow. All the parts of you that you've exiled, repressed, or silenced to fit into a life that was never truly yours. You might feel a creeping despair, a sense that something essential is missing. You wake up, go through the motions, meet expectations, smile on cue, and still something aches. That ache is not a flaw, it's a signal. A call to return to the inner world you've abandoned. In psychological terms, what you're experiencing is a disintegration of the persona, the social mask you wear to survive, that carefully constructed version of you who knows how to say the right thing, please the right people, succeed by the world's standards. But the more you invest in that mask, the more you starve your authentic self, and the cost of that starvation is emotional numbness, chronic anxiety, and a haunting sense of emptiness. When you're alone, the mask begins to slip. And what's underneath it isn't a failure. It's the part of you that's still alive, raw, unrefined, honest, and yes, sometimes painfully underdeveloped, because it's been ignored for so long. But it's also powerful beyond measure, because it's real. And real is rare. Most people would rather fill their lives with noise than face the silence that reveals this truth. But if you're here, if you've made it this far, it means something in you is ready to go deeper, to ask the question that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Who am I, really, when no one is watching? This question is not philosophical fluff, it's a psychological necessity. Your suffering isn't proof that something is wrong with you, it's proof that something false is being burned away. The pain of solitude is not the pain of isolation, it's the pain of returning to a self you forgot how to love. What you feel when you're alone is not an enemy, it's a mirror. And that mirror, as brutal as it may seem, is the only one that tells the truth. It reflects everything you've become as a result of who you thought you had to be, and if that image is painful, it's because your soul is grieving for the self you've lost in the process. But this isn't the end, this is the beginning. Because once the illusion starts to crack, once you realize that you've been living a script that wasn't yours, you gain something most people never do: awareness. And with awareness comes power. You begin to notice the lies you tell yourself just to sleep at night, the way you sabotage anything real because you're afraid you might lose it, the way you attract chaos to avoid stillness, chase approval to avoid self-acceptance, and bury your instincts under politeness, productivity, and performance. But in solitude, none of those tactics work. There's no audience to impress, no critic to fight, no one to manipulate or save. There's just you. And if that version of you feels unfamiliar, it's not because you're broken. It's because you've spent so long becoming someone else that you forgot who you were beneath it all. This is where the real journey begins, not outward but inward. And the path forward doesn't start with fixing yourself, it starts with facing yourself. Facing yourself doesn't require perfection, it requires honesty, and honesty begins in solitude. When there's no one to perform for, you can no longer lie about what you want, what you feel, or what you've been avoiding. You come face to face with your hunger for meaning, your fear of rejection, your buried rage, your unlived dreams. It's all there, waiting. And in the silence you begin to see just how loud your inner world really is. Every voice that told you to be good, quiet, successful, likable. Every wound that told you were too much or not enough. Every compromise that slowly chipped away at your authenticity until all that was left was a shell of performance. And it's not your fault. You were trained to adapt. You had to survive. But adaptation becomes pathology when it persists long after the danger is gone. This is why solitude feels dangerous to the mind that's still running old survival scripts. It has no stimulus to distract it, no identity to anchor it, so it begins to unravel. But this unraveling isn't a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. The unraveling is how you find what's real. You begin to notice the gap between what you say and what you feel, the distance between your actions and your value, the dissonance between the life you're living and the one that actually calls to you. And yes, it's destabilizing. You might feel lost, confused, even scared. That's the point. The ego resists change with everything it has. It clings to certainty, to structure, to identity. But healing doesn't reinforce your ego, it dissolves it. And that dissolution is not destruction. It's integration. What you discover in solitude is the existence of parts within you that have been split off, rejected, shamed into silence. These parts didn't disappear, they went underground, into the unconscious. And from there they've been influencing your thoughts, your choices, your relationships without your awareness. Every time you've overreacted, sabotaged yourself, repeated the same toxic dynamics, that wasn't just bad luck, that was the unconscious speaking through behavior. But when you sit alone long enough to feel what you usually suppress, something miraculous happens. You begin to meet those lost parts with curiosity instead of judgment. You begin to notice that the pain isn't there to punish you, it's there to reunite you with yourself. Solitude then becomes the stage where your unconscious content surfaces, not to harm you, but to be seen. Your anger, your sadness, your longing, your shame. They come up not because you're weak, but because they finally have space to breathe. And when you stop pushing them away, when you allow yourself to feel what you've been avoiding, the internal war begins to shift. You stop treating yourself like the enemy. You stop waging war against your own emotional truth. And in that moment, you begin to heal. But this healing is not clean or comfortable. It's messy, emotional, non-linear. You might cry without knowing why, feel rage you can't explain, remember things you thought you'd forgotten. This is the shadow coming to light. And the shadow is never the villain. It only becomes dangerous when it's ignored. When integrated, it becomes power. It becomes energy. It becomes the very fuel you need to live a life that's not just functional, but real. So many people ask, what's my purpose? But how can you know your purpose if you've never met your true self? How can you expect clarity when your inner world is full of contradictions you've never examined? You say you want peace, but you avoid silence. You say you want love, but you fear vulnerability. You say you want truth, but you cling to the narratives that protect your image, and the world reinforces it. We live in a culture that worships speed, success, and surface, but the soul doesn't work that way. The soul whispers. It moves slowly. It needs quiet to be heard. And in that quiet, something begins to happen. You start to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. You recall dreams you buried because someone laughed at them, desires you suppressed because they didn't fit the mold, emotions you numbed because they weren't acceptable. And suddenly, loneliness isn't loneliness anymore. It's intimacy, not with others, but with yourself. A kind of sacred reintroduction, the way you might sit with an old friend after years apart. There's awkwardness at first, hesitation, but beneath it all, a deep knowing, a recognition that friend is you. This kind of inner work can't be done in a group. It can't be done while performing or achieving or networking. It demands withdrawal, and not the kind of withdrawal that runs away from life, but the kind that runs toward the truth. It's not isolation, it's preservation. You step away not to disappear, but to reappear more fully aligned. You create space not to escape others, but to finally meet yourself. Because once you do, everything else changes. You stop tolerating what drains you. You stop chasing what isn't yours. You stop pretending to be someone you're not just to feel accepted. And yes, that means some things will fall apart. Relationships that were built on your performance may collapse. Careers that required your silence may no longer fit. Friendships based on mutual denial may fade. But in their place, something stronger emerges. A life that doesn't demand you betray yourself to be loved. A presence that doesn't vanish when you stop pleasing everyone. A self that can stand alone and say, I am enough. And here's the paradox. Once you become comfortable being alone, you're no longer lonely. Because you're no longer waiting for someone else to reflect your worth, you've found it within. And from that place of wholeness, every connection becomes richer, deeper, more honest. Not because you need it, but because you choose it. You begin to speak less and listen more, not just to others, but to yourself. You trust your intuition, you protect your energy, you create boundaries not to punish others, but to honor your own soul. And when you look in the mirror, you don't see someone who needs fixing, you see someone who's finally starting to come home. Because that's what this journey is, a homecoming. And solitude is the doorway. Most people will never walk through it. They'll keep filling the silence with noise, mistaking busyness for worth, attention for love, certainty for wisdom. But if you've made it here, it means you're different. It means you're ready, not to become someone new, but to remember who you've always been beneath the layers. This remembering is not about nostalgia. It's not about going backward or recapturing a version of yourself frozen in time. It's about stripping away what was never really you to begin with. It's about peeling back the layers of conditioning, approval-seeking, and emotional censorship that slowly buried your essence. And essence is not something you create. It's something you uncover, something that's always been there, beneath the fear, beneath the roles, beneath the compulsions to be who you thought the world wanted. When you sit with yourself in solitude long enough and honestly enough, you begin to notice what parts of you are alive and what parts are just habit. You begin to notice which thoughts are yours and which ones were planted by someone else. You realize that much of what you called your personality was actually just your defense mechanism. You didn't become quiet because you're shy. You became quiet because you were taught your voice was too much. You didn't become a perfectionist because you love excellence. You became one because you were taught mistakes made you unlovable. And in this light, even your coping mechanisms become sacred, not because they were right, but because they kept you alive. But survival is not the same as living. The tragedy is not that you had to protect yourself. The tragedy is that you forgot how to stop. You forgot how to rest in your own truth without armoring up. You forgot that it's possible to just be, without defending, without performing, without scanning every environment for who you need to become to be safe. Solitude reminds you of that possibility. It's a slow recalibration, a return to your internal compass. At first, it feels like emptiness, but stay with it and you'll realize it's spaciousness, space to feel, space to choose, space to remember. In that space, you'll begin to notice the small voice that never stopped whispering, the one you silenced for the sake of peace, for the illusion of belonging, for the paycheck, the partner, the applause. That voice isn't angry. It's patient. It's been waiting for you to get tired enough of the noise, tired enough of the act, tired enough of shrinking, and the moment you give it your attention, your entire inner world begins to reorganize around truth. Truth isn't flashy. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It doesn't try to convince. It simply is. And when you start to align with it, something incredible happens. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop apologizing for your existence. You stop trying to fix everything around you just to avoid what's unresolved within you, because you realize your worth was never up for negotiation. It was never contingent on your performance, your productivity, or your ability to be what others needed. It was there from the beginning, buried under layers of survival, and now it's rising. But don't expect everyone to understand. When you change the relationship you have with yourself, it changes your relationship with everyone else. Some people will resist. They'll call you selfish for choosing silence over availability. They'll say you've changed, become distant, become different. And they'll be right. You have changed. You've stopped making yourself small to maintain fragile peace. You've stopped leaking energy just to be perceived as kind. You've stopped abandoning yourself in subtle, daily betrayals that no one else could see but you could always feel. And yes, it's different now. You're different now. Not because you added more layers, but because you finally took them off. There's a kind of confidence that doesn't come from achievement or image. It comes from alignment. When your inner world and outer expression begin to mirror each other, you walk differently. You speak more slowly. You no longer feel the need to justify your no or over-explain your yes. You listen more, not because you're trying to be liked, but because you genuinely value silence. You don't rush to fill it anymore. You've learned that most of what people say is to avoid the discomfort of truth, and you're no longer interested in adding to the noise. This kind of presence doesn't just shift your psychology, it shifts your energy. People feel it, even if they can't explain it. You become the calm in the room without needing to control anything. You become the mirror others are afraid to look into, not because you're judgmental, but because your clarity exposes what they've been avoiding in themselves. This is the power of inner stillness. This is the weight of psychological maturity. It's not loud, it's not performative, but it's unmistakable. And once you taste it, you stop chasing the highs of distraction. You start craving depth. You realize that most people are addicted to stimulation not because they love life, but because they fear what life will reveal in the absence of it. And maybe you're still in that transition. Maybe solitude still feels awkward, even painful. That's okay. It takes time to detox from a life of performance. It takes time to sit in silence and not confuse it with emptiness. It takes time to meet the parts of you you've neglected and to offer them presence instead of punishment. But it's worth it, because on the other side of that process is the kind of freedom that can't be taken from you, not because you've built a wall, but because you've built a self. A self that doesn't need external permission to exist, a self that can feel pain without becoming the pain, a self that can walk away without drama, a self that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't perform, a self that chooses solitude when needed, not as an escape from life, but as a return to it. And from that space you begin to build something unshakable, a life not driven by fear, but by resonance, not guided by validation, but by inner truth, not filled to the brim with noise, but designed with intentional stillness. This is the beginning of individuation, not as a concept, but as a lived reality, the journey of becoming whole, of integrating the fragments you've long ignored. It doesn't happen in a weekend workshop or a motivational video. It happens moment by moment, choice by choice. Every time you choose to stay with yourself instead of running. Every time you sit in discomfort and breathe instead of reacting. Every time you hear the voice of your younger self and offer it compassion instead of shame. That's the work, that's the path, and it's not for everyone. But if you're still here, if something inside you is resonating, then maybe it's for you. Not because you're broken, but because you're done pretending not to be whole. Wholeness isn't about being perfect, it's about being integrated. It's knowing that you carry both light and shadow and refusing to exile either one. The parts of you that you once disowned, the anger, the fear, the need, the wildness, are not signs of weakness. They are energies waiting to be accepted, understood, and redirected. And solitude is where that reclamation begins, because when the world is quiet, when no one's watching, when the roles fall away, what's left is the truth of your condition, and in that raw space, something sacred happens. You stop running. You stop editing yourself. You stop narrating your life through someone else's expectations. You sit with the hurt, the longing, the confusion, and you realize it was never about fixing anything. It was always about remembering what you've spent your whole life trying not to feel, and you feel it, maybe for the first time, not to suffer, but to finally release. This release doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it's just a quiet exhale after years of holding your breath. Sometimes it's a single tear rolling down your cheek when you realize that what you thought was self-hatred was really just pain that never had a safe place to land. You start to see your life through a new lens, not as a series of failures, but as a map of how you've tried to cope with being disconnected from yourself. You see how much of your suffering came not from what happened to you, but from the stories you created to make sense of it. Stories that told you you were too sensitive, too needy, too weak, too much. But you're not too much. You were just too much for a world that rewards numbness and punishes vulnerability. And maybe for the first time you stop trying to explain your pain to people who are committed to misunderstanding it. You stop needing others to validate what you know in your bones to be true. You stop trying to rescue people who don't want to be rescued, or be rescued by people who never learned how to hold space for themselves. You become your own anchor, not out of arrogance or self-sufficiency, but out of necessity, because you realize that no one else can do this work for you, and no one else is coming to save you from a reality you've been avoiding with activity, codependency, and distraction. Solitude reveals this with brutal clarity, but that clarity is the very thing that frees you. Freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about no longer being ruled by unconscious needs. It's about seeing your patterns for what they are, responses to pain, and choosing differently. You begin to notice when your mind tries to reach for the phone, the food, the dopamine hit, not because you want to connect, but because you're trying to avoid discomfort. You catch yourself mid-reaction and ask, what am I really feeling right now? And in that moment, you choose presence over habit. That choice, repeated over time, changes everything. You develop a kind of intimacy with yourself that no external relationship can replace. You learn your rhythms, your cycles, your triggers. You learn how to be gentle with your nervous system, how to listen to your body, how to discern between intuition and fear. And you realize that for most of your life, you weren't broken. You were just overstimulated, overextended, and emotionally malnourished. You were drowning in a sea of expectations that had nothing to do with your soul. But now, you're learning how to breathe again. Breathing, real breathing, requires presence. And presence can't be faked. It's not a performance, it's an energetic truth. When you're truly present, people feel it. You're no longer multitasking through conversations. You're not rehearsing your responses or curating your personality. You're here. And ironically, the more rooted you become in yourself, the more you begin to attract relationships that reflect that depth, not because you need them, but because you're finally available for something real, something reciprocal, something that honors your wholeness, instead of requiring you to fragment yourself just to be loved. You begin to redefine what love even means. It's no longer about someone filling your void or rescuing you from solitude. It's about two whole beings choosing to witness and grow with each other without losing themselves. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop chasing potential and start valuing presence. You stop giving your energy to people who leave you feeling more alone than if you were actually by yourself. Understand now that the most painful loneliness isn't being alone, it's being unseen while in the presence of others. That understanding reshapes everything. You no longer settle, not because you've become cold or guarded, but because your standards are now aligned with your soul, not your fear. You'd rather spend a Friday night in deep reflection than in a crowded room performing a version of yourself you've outgrown. You stop tolerating half connections, breadcrumb communication, and relationships built on obligation. You stop saying yes when your whole body is screaming no. You stop negotiating your peace just to maintain appearances. Because you've learned through solitude that your peace is priceless and no one else can protect it but you. This kind of self-trust doesn't come from affirmations or vision boards. It comes from rupture and repair. From sitting through the discomfort of your own silence and coming out the other side with a sense of, I can hold myself through this. It comes from showing up for your own breakdowns, again and again, until they become breakthroughs. Until you realize that the goal isn't to never fall apart. The goal is to know that when you do, you know how to put yourself back together. Not perfectly, not neatly, but truthfully. And the truth is, you're not afraid of being alone. You're afraid of what being alone might reveal. But the irony is, what it reveals is exactly what you've been searching for. Your truth, your path, your power. Everything you thought you needed from others, validation, approval, permission, love, you learn to source from within. And when you do, you stop chasing and start choosing. You stop asking, what do they think of me, and start asking, what do I think of me? You stop building a life that looks good and start building one that feels good, one that aligns with your values, your essence, your truth. This is how transformation happens. Not all at once, not in a dramatic spiritual awakening, but in these small, quiet moments of honesty, in the decision to feel what's uncomfortable instead of escaping it. In the commitment to meet yourself exactly where you are, without judgment. Over and over, you choose to stay. Stay with the pain, stay with the silence, stay with the process. And slowly, staying becomes healing. Healing becomes clarity, clarity becomes strength, and strength becomes freedom. Freedom, in its truest form, is not something that shouts. It doesn't demand attention or validation. It simply exists. Quiet, grounded, undeniable. It's the kind of freedom that doesn't flinch when left alone with itself. It doesn't panic in stillness or crave noise to feel alive. It has nothing to prove because it's no longer performing. That's the paradox of the inner journey. What you feared would break you actually becomes the foundation of your strength. The very solitude that once felt like punishment becomes your sanctuary, not because you've learned to enjoy being alone, but because you've remembered how to be with yourself. And the world shifts in response, not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly and unmistakably. You begin to notice the spaces where you used to shrink and now stand tall. The conversations where you would have stayed quiet but now speak from truth, not ego. The moments where you would have reached for distraction and instead breathed into discomfort with full presence. These shifts are not for show. They're not about becoming impressive, they're about becoming whole. And wholeness doesn't need to be explained, it just is. It radiates. It speaks through presence, through choice, through calm. You may still feel the pull of your old self from time to time, the need to be liked, to fix others, to apologize for taking up space, but now you recognize it. You see the reflex before it becomes reaction, and in that awareness you reclaim your power. Again and again you choose self-respect over self-erasure, not out of defiance, but out of alignment. You realize that peace is not a place you arrive at, It's a practice, a commitment to keep returning to yourself, even when the world tries to pull you back into fragmentation. There will be people who don't understand this new version of you, who feel threatened by your boundaries, confused by your quiet, or offended by your clarity. That's okay. Their discomfort is not your burden. You're not responsible for making others comfortable with your growth. You're only responsible for staying true to the path that your soul has chosen. And solitude will always be part of that path. Not as exile, but as invitation. Not as punishment, but as pilgrimage. Because the deeper you go into yourself, the more of yourself you retrieve. And the more of yourself you retrieve, the more fully you can show up in life. Not as an actor, not as a role, but as a real, living human being with depth, presence, and boundaries. This is the essence of individuation, not perfection, not arrival, but integration, the ongoing work of making room for all that you are, your light, your shadow, your truth, your contradictions. It's a reclamation of energy, of agency, of soul, and it begins in solitude. In the moments when no one else is around to validate your existence, when no one's watching, applauding, or affirming, when all that's left is you, that's where the alchemy begins. You start to see that the external world was never the answer. Not the relationship, not the job, not the next goal. They were never meant to complete you. They were meant to reflect the inner state you've cultivated. And when that state is rooted in self-trust, self-awareness, and deep internal alignment, you stop chasing life and start creating it. From the inside out, not based on fear or fantasy, but on truth. And truth, once felt deeply, changes everything. It changes how you love. You no longer confuse attachment with devotion. You understand that real love requires space, honesty, and mutual growth. You're no longer attracted to chaos, to emotional highs and lows that mask emptiness. You seek connection, not distraction, and you offer your heart, not to be saved, but to be seen. To be met, soul to soul, without masks. It changes how you work. You no longer hustle to prove your worth. You don't sacrifice your mental or emotional health on the altar of productivity. You value presence over performance, purpose over pressure. You create not to impress, but to express. You lead not to dominate, but to serve. You rest not as a luxury, but as a necessity, because you finally understand your energy is sacred. It changes how you relate to pain. You stop fearing it. You stop running from it. You welcome it as a teacher, a signal, a guide. You learn to sit with your wounds without turning them into weapons. You stop blaming others for what they couldn't give you and start giving yourself what you've always needed: love, patience, forgiveness, space. You realize that healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about reclaiming the parts of you that got lost in the process. And perhaps most importantly, it changes how you see yourself. You no longer define yourself by your trauma, your titles, your past mistakes, or your future ambitions. You see yourself clearly as a complex, evolving being. Flawed, yes, but worthy, capable of both darkness and light. And in that recognition you find peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because you've stopped needing it to be. So if you're sitting in silence right now, if you're in the middle of a season of solitude, wondering if something's wrong with you because everything feels like it's falling apart, take a breath. You're not broken. You're being revealed. Everything that no longer serves you is being stripped away, not to punish you, but to set you free. The emptiness you feel isn't a void, it's a clearing, a space for truth to return. And in that space, you will find the parts of yourself you thought were lost forever, the ones you abandoned to be accepted, the ones you silenced to be safe, the ones you buried to belong. And when you gather them back, piece by piece, breath by breath, you will no longer fear being alone. Because you'll realize you were never really alone. You were always there, waiting to be found.